Welcome, everyone, to Asian Pacific Voices Radio, where you will find stimulating conversations about a variety of topics and stories that affect our communities. I'm your host, Sasha Fu, and today I am so pleased to welcome our guest, Gingerlily Lowe. Now, I met Gingerlily not all that long ago in an online artist group that formed during COVID when we were desperately trying to find other ways to connect with each other. Gingerlily is a San Diego-based theater artist, a well-known actor, director, and playwright who focuses many of her efforts on telling the stories of the Asian American communities. Welcome, Gingerlily.
Yes, I am Gingerlily Lowe, and I am the co-founder and president of Asian Story Theater. We've been doing theater for a long time here in San Diego, and I started this theater journey with Pacific Asian Actors Ensemble in San Diego, the first Asian American theater company here. In around 1979, we started gathering together and produced our first show in like 1981 or so.
I wanted to say that you've been a trailblazer, and I'm going to kind of reiterate some of the achievements that you have under your belt. You founded, as you mentioned, the Pacific Asian Actors Ensemble, which was the first Asian theater company here in San Diego. And you have also toured in other cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and devoted a lot of your theater efforts towards children. Your present theater company, Asian Story Theater, performs throughout San Diego. So if we're going to backtrack a little bit, I want to ask you about your childhood, where you grew up, and where you developed this fascination and love for the theater.
Oh, well, I actually was born in Los Angeles, Chinatown, and grew up there, and also spent a bit of time in San Francisco, Chinatown, where my father grew up. He lived right on Grant Avenue, and while he was there, they used to call him the Bean Sprout Prince because my grandfather started a bean sprout business that first started marketing to Westerners. So he took his bean sprouts to Safeway and kind of introduced those. So one of the things we always are so proud of is like, oh, all those Lofans, the white people eating our bean sprouts. Yeah, that's because my grandfather actually started that business and started marketing outside of Chinatown. But I grew up in Chinatown, Los Angeles, and my father loved the theater, and he took us to theater very early on. We lived near the Music Center in those days, and my first Broadway tour of a show was Showboat. And I can remember still that big, gigantic boat coming out onto the stage and splitting open. It was just amazing to me. And then all through school, I used to, like at recess time, have a group of students, mostly girls, but we'd go down to the basement, which was where the girls' restroom was. And there was like a big hall there. And we would make up stories, and I would direct and say, okay, now we're going to tell Cinderella. And we would, I'd give everybody parts and we would all play. And then we'd come back to class and say, can we do a little show? we do little plays, that the teacher would go,
teachers always
sure,
had to say yes.
Right.
I want to ask you about your childhood and growing up as a consumer of pop culture,
on stage
TV
and in TV at the time.
Movies.
There were really no Asians in the media. And so we saw very, very rarely Asians performing.
And how did that affect you?
Well, by the time I was in high school, because I did, participate in the theater program there, and it was very difficult to get cast and get experience. I joined a little troupe with other Asian artists who were feeling similarly that, you just didn't get opportunities. And so how do you hone your craft? And so we formed the Pacific Asian Actors Ensemble, started by Tom Sesma, who is now an actor on Broadway. He was at UCSD, and he kind of gathered some of us together, and we made a little home at the Marquis Public Theater, where Kent Brisby, who's now currently my husband, was the director at the Gallery Theater. And so we actually were able to have a little residency in that theater and just put on shows where we used multi-ethnic casts and different artists, and said, somebody said they wanted to work on costume design. And so we had a Japanese costume designer, who did our shows, and actors, and we just kind of all got a chance to have experience.
And at that time, casting multiculturally was kind of groundbreaking. That wasn't being done a lot, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Also during this period, we were, because we never made money at the theater, but we were, I guess we kind of got involved with the children's theater that actually operated out of the Midwest. And
Mm.
they hired Kent to cast from the West Coast and bring some more shows. They had a lot of theater for children going on all across the country. And these were like big, 3,000 seat houses, but they always had, it was always, you know, uh, Babes in Toyland and Wizard of Oz, and very white. And we would cast those with multi ethnic casts, and sometimes do a little gender bending as well, which was quite controversial. But then when we traveled, we realized what a value that was, because just like I grew up and never saw, Asians on stage, little kids would come over to me and they would be so enthusiastic to see
Aw,
me on stage because I looked like
good.
them. And they would say that, you look just like me. And
Yeah,
it was just like the most gratifying thing that I realized, oh, that value of being seen, just being seen, how important that was.
absolutely. Was that one of the reasons you decided at some point to focus more on telling Asian focused stories, stories that come out of Asian folklore? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, after doing a few years of these shows, we started looking around. I said, well, why are we always doing, Babes in Toyland and The Wizard of Oz? There's so many wonderful stories that we can tell, and maybe we can just tell them ourselves. And so at that time, we were quite involved with the San Diego Chinese Center downtown. In fact, Kent and I were volunteers on the board, and we would help to just schedule all the entertainment for the New Year's Fair. And one of I guess the director at the time brought a grant that she had discovered. She said, you guys do theater. Maybe this would be something that we could do, and educate other people about Chinese culture. And that fit right into the things that we wanted to do. I also taught school at the time, and I had my sixth graders. We were supposed to learn about ancient China at the time. And, one of my students just said to me, teacher, I know nothing Chinese. And I thought, oh, yeah, that's so true. Let's go to the library and let's get some books. And I realized the only stories that were at the library were the same stories that I had when I was growing up in the 60s. It was like Tiki Tiki Tembo was a Chinese story about
Yeah,
a family that named their
right.
children with such long names that he basically drowns in a well, right? And so that's why the moral of the story is that's why Chinese people have short names. And then another story is the story of Ping, about a little duck who gets whacked on the bottom.
So you clearly
And
recognized a need to tell more stories involving Asian families, Asian kids, Asian culture, and that was very successful, right?
yeah, so we started the Chinese Story Theater, and right away, they were stories that I had grown up with, going to Chinese movies with my grandmother in San Francisco, Chinatown. We started with the story of the White Snake, Green Snake, and then Journey to the West. Did several stories about the Monkey King and his adventures. And we did those stories for children here in San Diego. We had we saw thousands of kids actually, and then later on did a little bit of traveling up to Los Angeles at the Wadsworth, and then in San Francisco at the Palace of Fine Arts. And it was really cool to have kids of lots of diversity seeing our shows, and then on our stages we also had a lot of diversity. One of the important things about our theater was we never wanted to make it as just Asians performing shows for Asians. We wanted these stories to become part of the mainstream for more people to know them. And so it was always important to include a lot of different people in the storytelling.
Do you think you were able to achieve that aim or at least make some progress towards that?
Well, over the years, we've had some wonderful stories from other people who've heard like actors talk about, there always are questions about what inspired you to get into theater. And, there's an actor in San Diego named Willie Green, and someone else called us afterwards and said, I was at this panel talk back, and he said the what really inspired him to go see or become an actor was he went with his school to see
Oh,
a show about the Monkey King at the Lyceum Theater, and he saw like these people like doing this incredible thing, and he said that's what he wanted to do. And
oh
we've
my
run
gosh.
across that so many times where people say, "Oh, I remember, yeah, I used to go to this show and it really just kind of changed my world." Or, later on, we've worked with other actors who said, when I was a little kid, I saw this show at the Wadsworth. And he's, oh, that was us.
That must be
So,
so gratifying to hear these stories about how your theater has moved people and maybe even moved them to become artists themselves. In your body of work, the different kinds of theater that you've done, the different stories you've told, is there one work that you just love, 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 your favorite?
well, there are several. I mean, the Monkey King stories have always been fun. But we started doing something a little different. Now we've become Asian Story Theater, so we've expanded our focus and became a nonprofit from the Chinese Story Theater. And we started working on different shows based on the community. And one of them was called The Stories from the Sun Cafe.
Mm,
Downtown, there's an old restaurant called the Sun Cafe. For a long time, that was considered the longest running restaurant in San Diego. And when we started looking more into it, we realized it was actually started by a Japanese family during the time when redlining was still happening. And if you were a person of color, you could not buy property outside of 21st Street. I think there was a
mm,
red line there. And so, but people of color could buy property along, downtown where the brothels were, basically.
mm,
And so that's where the first Asian communities formed. The Sun
mhm.
Cafe originally was a shooting gallery that the Obayashis had bought and started a business there. But they sold soup that was so good that more people came for the soup than the shooting gallery. And so they built this restaurant called the Sun Cafe. And all around them, there were all these different families that kind of grew up in this community, tofu houses, and of course
Uh-huh.
the brothels and all kinds of other businesses as well. When the internment came,
Mm,
then other families had to move in because those people were all taken to the internment camps, right?
yeah.
And so it really changed, and but it became like a Greek restaurant and then later on a Chinese restaurant, and
Mm.
continued to run like all the way to 2000. Later on, it became Funky Garcia's at the Sun Cafe or something like that. But it ran for a long time. Anyways, in doing the research for that show, we started interviewing, these 85, 90-year-old, uh, pe I guess, families and
Mhm,
people from, the Japanese temple, and we created a show that kind of told their different stories and some of the accomplishments they had and their experiences, And then when we started to do the shows, lots of the younger family members came and had never heard some of these stories.
Oh,
So they were just be in tears and so touched and so moved,
yeah.
and thankful, that their stories were being told. And so have since then continued to do some other shows like What Are You, Hollow Hollow. Our last show was a musical called Not Working, and it was actually about the pandemic. We reached
Hmm.
out to a lot of different composers of color and asked them to send us music and then kind of put them into a program that just told, what our different diverse communities were going through.
As an
So.
independent theater, a smaller theater, how difficult is it to get these wonderful ideas into production? I would imagine money is always a big question mark.
Yeah, that is always very difficult. My husband, Kent, is always working on grants, and that's how we've been able to produce these shows for all this time. A lot of times, also, when you're working with, communities that don't often attend theater or they're communities of color, they don't spend the same kind of money in theater. They're
Mhm.
not used to it as well. So we always try to keep a very inexpensive, ticket. Um, a lot of times we're introducing people to the theater for the first time. It might be the
Mhm.
first time that they've been to the theater when they come to see a show, and they might just hear about it from someone else. So it is always a challenge. So in fact, the last show that we did, we basically made the tickets free, and then,
Wow.
anybody who was, willing to, just donate or pay, a little something, that was, so we were so thankful and gratified for it, but we really just wanted people to be able to come and see the shows.
So your nonprofit is largely supported by grants, is that right? Seems like
Mostly.
that's the case, yeah. It's difficult in this environment where so many arts groups are vying for the shrinking public dollars. Is there advice that you would give to artists who are trying to either make a film or produce a play or, start a theater company of their own?
It's tough, right? It's a tough business, but I mean, part of the reason why we do it is we really just have no choice. It's a passion, right? Something that we feel driven to do. And so you just keep making art, and then you hope that other people will come, and usually, it is very appreciated. Um but I have great hope for the future because I do see some of these bigger companies starting to make more room in their programming to
Mhm.
include more diverse stories for sure. For a long time, I felt like even in San Diego theater, in the mainstream theater companies, that it's a very rare thing to see artists of color, especially of Asian descent, on the stages, and certainly seeing stories, Asian stories told is very rare. And but I'm starting to see a little more of it, and I'm starting to see more people of color in our audiences here. That's another thing that even my husband and I continue to go see theater here in San Diego and in Los Angeles. And it's always very interesting because when we go to LA, we definitely see more families and more people of color sitting in the seats. Sometimes I go to a show here in San Diego and I look around and I realize I'm the only person who's not white here. And that's always
Ah.
really interesting.
Speaking
So.
of differences between white and non-white, your husband is Caucasian and he works on a lot of the projects which are focused on the Asian experience. How do you make that work? I'm sure his point of view is also valuable in terms of acting as a collaborator.
I mean, I think it's been a really good partnership. He actually grew up, his formidable years were on islands, and in Saipan and Yap and in Hawaii. And so I think he has a special kinship with some of the things, that I'm really interested in as well. And in
Mhm.
fact, I always, felt like that was his superpower, being a white male in theater. In fact, if we didn't have him, we wouldn't have had the opportunity at Pacific Asian Actors Ensemble. So he was really our artistic director at the beginning. He knew a lot more than we did, had a lot more experiences. Doors were open to him that were not open to us. And
And
so
that's
the fact
because
that
of his being Caucasian?
a white man, right? I
Oh.
mean, even women didn't really have access to, if they wanted to direct a show. I'm thinking like in those days, I very rarely saw a woman director
Hmm.
in the theater. And so at that time, to have that opportunity, it was really important actually that somebody say, oh, we're going to open the doors and bring this viewpoint in.
Mm.
And but he also is writing for his daughter as well. And, his now family is Asian. So the things that we, present have a lot to do with things that he really cares about.
Great. I've talked to other folks on this podcast about the myth of the model minority, and I'm sure you're familiar with that Asian people are successful in America because they don't rock the boat. They just put their nose to the grindstone. They don't make a lot of noise. They don't try to be disruptive. They don't ask for more. They don't ask for changes. In some ways, that myth has been somewhat destructive to our communities because it's baked in expectations about what we can achieve as a group. How has that myth affected your career as a theater maker? Do you think it has inhibited you from taking some opportunities or chances?
There are things that sometimes I hear my father, who was a physicist actually. He was told by his high school teacher not to worry about his grades or try to expect more because kids like him would not be able to go to college. And he ended up going, being drafted in the war and getting a GI Bill, which opened up a door for him. And so he became a physicist, actually graduated with the first, I guess, the physics department opened in San Francisco State University.
Mm.
And so he was part of that first class that went through. And I remember him, like, even though he really took us to the theater, he would have my sister and I do these little presentations or little shows and things. But he would also say things like, don't stick your head up too far because, the nail that sticks up is the one that gets hammered. He would have
Mhm.
these little sayings about, what our place was, and that as a minority, that he knew that part of being successful was also being quiet, right?
Mm.
And so I think he kind of lived a life like that. In some ways was proud because his children weren't really like that. They would speak up, they would, participate in different things. They were in, doing theater, which he always loved and thought was great. And then on the other hand, not really knowing or understanding how to navigate that himself, right? Um,
So, how does that translate to your experience since you're not following your father in terms of that type of thinking, but you're aware that there is this myth that, if you speak up too loud, you're going to get pushed down?
I I think I think that it's kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, in some ways, I don't believe that we should aspire towards, that quiet way of slipping through. By the same token, I know sometimes personally I've not like decided to pursue going to Hollywood or doing that kind of thing. And then but on our own, I have a great partner who has made a life of theater for us. Now, not a life that we've made money in, but really we've left a strong legacy of theater and programming that a lot of people have seen and will remember in some way, and hopefully, feel some validation because something is represented that they can understand and relate to as well. So we've kind of done it the other way. We've just kind of self-produced things over the years, and we're able to do that.
And
And
you've been very
I
successful.
look at a lot of the younger folks now, and I'm just in such admiration that they're going out there and they're knocking on the doors and they're getting their things in. And I'm envious of that. By the same token, I don't know, that's a whole nother life. And at this age and stage, I'm not sure if I, am ready or would have been willing to do that.
Gingerlily, you
So,
have a lot to be proud about because you have blazed a trail for many theater creators, all these actors that, like you cited, they saw your early productions and said that inspired them to enter the theater. My question to you now is, what's next for Asian Story Theater? What are some projects that you're excited about?
well, one of the things that we've been talking about for a long time is, Asian ghost stories are
Yeah.
are so wonderful and juicy. And I've always wanted to do like a little program called Asian Scary Theater, more of like a radio show, but kind of
Uh-huh.
bringing in all these wonderful Asian stories from across the diaspora. Um, Another show that Kent has been working on is Coffee Stories. And
Mm.
there are a lot of wonderful, that's a really unique kind of outlook also on, just because there's so many different coffees grown all around the world and the stories that might kind of go around with them.
Wow.
So he's
Yeah.
got that in mind as well. And so those are a couple of things that we're kind of working on right now. But we'll just continue to like make theater, make
Great,
shows
great
and
theater,
tell
theater that is
stories.
going to entertain us, enrich us, and hopefully enlighten us. Thank you so much. We're going to wrap up, but we want to ask, can we find out more about you through social media, and what are the platforms that you or Asian Story Theater are on?
Yeah, you can find us on asianstorytheater.org and also on Facebook, Asian Story Theater. Theater with a ER, so not the RE.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Gingerlily, for telling us all about your history, your love of theater, and what's ahead for Asian Story Theater. We also want to welcome our audience to hear from you and our listeners and about suggestions that you might have about future guests on this podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, as well as follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Asian Pacific Voices Radio is produced by Asian Culture and Media Alliance. It's a nonprofit that empowers our Asian and Pacific Islander communities with a voice through media arts. And if you would like to support our program, please visit this website, AsianPacificVoicesRadio.com. I'm Sasha Fu, your host, and thank you so much for listening. Please join us next week for another exciting and thought-provoking episode of Asian Pacific Voices Radio. Take care. We'll see you then.